think we're going to transition into our first presentation. Samir, come on up.
And thank you again for being here. Again, my name is Samir Assar. I'm the Director for the Division of Produce Safety at the Food and Drug Administration. And I appreciate everything that has been said so far, Dr. Ostrov's comments and PSA's comments. You can tell they've done this before, and we greatly appreciate everything that's been done to set this up. Just kind of operating off of Dr. Ostrov's comments that this has been a long and winding road. It really has. It's been a journey that we've all been on together, and it started even before the proposed rule was developed, even back in 2011, although, again, farm visits and listening sessions that we did. And along the way, we've learned a lot in this process. FDA has learned a lot, and we have certainly addressed comments and concerns along this journey. I would say in the proposed rule, we heard in the comments that we received the challenges associated with the numerical criteria. And so we addressed those challenges in a proposal that was laid out in the supplemental rule, and I would say with respect to the final rule, we built in some additional flexibility around our original approach to develop kind of a baseline-driven water quality profile to one that's more around a rolling approach. And now here we are again in recognition of all the comments and concerns about the final rule requirements. We're taking a step back and we're looking at the final rule requirements and trying to figure out ways to simplify these requirements. And again, we appreciate you being here and helping us in that. All throughout this journey, we have addressed comments and concerns, and in doing so, we've kept with our public health goal. And we, as we move forward in this discussion and any other discussions that we have about this issue, we will certainly, keep this in mind and keep this in forefront. And believe me, we knew when we started this journey, this wasn't going to be easy, and I think most of you recognize that. Water is by far the most challenging area to tackle in the development of any food safety program, and I know this because I've talked to some of you about this. I know firsthand from the work that you've done to address water in your respective food safety programs, it's not easy, and it has taken time, and there's been a lot of discussion around how best to address water in these food safety programs. And so I would just say, because it's not easy doesn't mean that we can't figure it out all together. And that's why you're here, and that's why we're here. And your role, which we greatly appreciate, is to, again, provide your perspective and insights on water requirements in view of the produce safety rule. And our role as FDA is to listen and to learn about any new information. So we really look forward to a very productive engagement, and to stimulate a productive engagement, we're going to provide some kind of background information. Chelsea, Kruti, and I will provide some background information for your consideration as we move forward with this discussion. I will provide some high-level points for your consideration, and Kruti and Chelsea will provide more detailed, provide you with more detailed information about how we got to where we are today with respect to the produce safety rule. And so there are 3 points that I'll talk about, and hopefully these will be helpful for you in the general sessions and in the breakout discussions that you'll have today. And the first thing I'd like to talk to you about is the regulatory framework that we're operating under. And that regulatory framework includes the FSMA statute, the rule, the produce safety rule, and pending guidances as well. We get a lot of questions about how all of these pieces fit together. And so entertain me for a little bit here. I'm going to use an analogy that I hope will help you visualize how these pieces work together. And I would think about the regulatory framework in terms of constructing a house or building a home. In constructing a house, you lay down a foundation. And with the regulatory framework, the foundation is the law, is the FSMA statute. In constructing a house, you're building wood framing and windows and a roof. And this analogy, the wood framing roof, that structure function, is the produce safety rule. And constructing a house, well, I would say after you construct the house, it's an empty house. There's nothing inside. It's not a very comfortable house, and you need furniture to kind of live in that house, to be comfortable. And in our analogy, the furniture is the guidance that's pending right now. And it really, again, the guidance is intended to help the rule become more understandable. And so what we're doing right now as part of this process is we're taking a step back, and we're looking at the house, and we're looking through the house, and we're trying to determine what needs to change, and what inside can it be addressed by a kind of an addition or some kind of construction around the house, or do we move furniture around or add furniture into that house to make it more understandable for the community? And so I hope everyone appreciates that analogy. I know I probably made our lawyers back at FDA very nervous about it. So the next point I'd like for you to think about is, and I'd really encourage you to consider, it's the starting point for this discussion, which is the water testing and sampling requirements in the produce safety rule. It's really, again, the starting point for this discussion. And I would say that our regulatory process is such that it's much more manageable for us to make changes when we foundate those changes or anchor those changes on an existing framework or an existing regulation. And so I would say then, in other words, one way of putting it is that if you're proposing that we take the approach, let's say E, it's not very helpful to us unless you start at our starting point A, which is the produce safety rule and the water requirements, and you kind of look to see what the concerns are with respect to A, and if A doesn't work, you move on to B and C, and then D to finally get to E. We need to explain that path, that crosswalk in our regulatory approach. And there again, it's important for the discussion to be anchored on the final rule. And while doing that crosswalk, I would also keep in mind the rationale that we utilize to support the regulation. It's very important. And really, again, I guess thinking again about the house analogy, any construction that you would do or any furniture changes that you would make, you would have to take into account the existing house. You can't just build it off on its own. The third point I would like to make really kind of circles back to my opening, which is that that we're here to listen and we're here to learn about any new information. And we've done this throughout this journey that we've been on, and been getting back with the farm visits and the listening sessions and the public meetings that happen before, during, after the proposed rule, the supplemental rule, and the final rule, and we'll continue, quite frankly. And this is one very important meeting or summit. And I'd just like to say it's not the end of the discussion, like Betsy has said and others have said. We are going to do other engagements moving forward, and we'll be doing farm visits, and you'll hear a little bit about the opportunities that we're taking advantage of to really kind of get a holistic understanding of the issues that are at play here. And we're committed in this regulatory process to being transparent, and we're also involved in the social media. We're tweeting things out about the summit, and we're happy that PSA is doing that as well. So as we continue down this journey and as we're engaging the community, we are going to be transparent about that. And I would also say that our regulatory process is transparent as well. Typically we issue a tentative decision or announce a tentative decision, we will open up that decision for comment, and we'll take those relevant comments into account as we finalize our position. and you're seeing kind of the front end of that with the compliance date extension associated with the water requirements. And at this stage, we're going through the comments and looking to take into account those comments as we move forward with a decision as to whether or not we'll finalize the proposal into a final rule. And so that's part of our commitment to this process, to be transparent as possible, as transparent as the law allows. And there are certainly some restrictions around that, but we are committed to it, and we will share as much as we can about our thinking along the way. And I'll just close by saying that that we again look forward to a very productive discussion, and it is I appreciate Betsy and Gretchen's comments about moving forward. We really are focused on moving forward. Certainly there are a lot of questions about where we are, what was the basis for the rule, and certainly we should have those conversations, but we're looking forward to a kind of forward-moving conversations. What do we do from here? And so, and you'll hear as we're participating in the various breakout sessions, that's what we're going to kind of look, kind of ask or suggest or encourage you to consider, as opposed to just kind of revisiting things that we're looking to kind of address as part of this process. And so, again, appreciate being here, and we're looking forward to making this house a befitting place for the community to be in. So thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I'll hand it over to, I guess, who's next? Kruti. All right.
Thank you, Samir. We'd like to introduce Kruti Ravaliya to open up some of the additional slides and talk for FDA. And then also Chelsea Davidson from the FDA team. They're both consumer safety officers within the produce safety staff.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, PSA, for hosting this event. Thank you all for being here this morning. I just wanted to say we're really looking forward to conversations over the next couple days, and I appreciate everyone's willingness to be here. This morning, I'm going to be talking about the first two pieces on this slide, the review and the requirements, and then Chelsea will go ahead and talk about the reassessment. So to start, we've heard a lot of feedback from stakeholders saying that they're unaware of the industry practices and other programs that are out there that maybe we have or have not evaluated in considering the requirements for the produce safety rule and the ag water subpart. So I just wanted to go over that a little bit. And I'm also going to review a few pieces from the 2014 memo that FDA published regarding the water quality criteria. In that memo, we discussed the relevant recommendations from the WHO and EPA's recreational water quality criteria from 1986 and 2012. So for current industry practices, we reviewed Good Agricultural Practices, the GAPS program, and included in that the Harmonized GAPS program, as well as other third-party audits and buyer requirements, as well as commodity-specific guidelines. So in that evaluation, we determined that the GAPS program, as it is a voluntary audit-based system, isn't necessarily something that is enforceable since it is voluntary. And so if it's not enforceable, how is it something that can be applied across the board? Additionally, with third-party audits and buyer requirements, those vary as well. They vary from farm to farm, they vary from state to state, they vary from third party to third party. And so again, there's the enforceability issue associated with those requirements. They also vary as far as risk goes on the farm. Certain types of commodities are going to have different types of risks as compared to other commodities. And so again, it's enforceability issues. And then again, there's also commodity-specific guidelines, and again, there's variability associated with those commodity-specific guidelines. the GABS program that's specific for tomatoes may not necessarily be applicable for leafy greens. In the 2014 memo, we addressed the recommendations from the World Health Organization for the use of reclaimed water in the production of both leafy crops and root crops. And we determined that the overall approach, is one based on identifying the risk in the production practices using certain types of water. And those risks can be managed by health protection factors and health protection measures. Those health protection measures then impact the health outcome, the public health outcome in the production of fresh produce. So ultimately, what the program seeks to recommend in the production of fresh produce is that the tolerable health burden should be no greater than that adopted for drinking water, which is actually a pretty strict requirement. The framework that the WHO program outlines is one of identifying risks and presenting ways to manage those risks. So it's a combination of factors. You'd be looking at wastewater management, you'd be looking at how that water is applied, and you'd be looking at production after the farm, or not production after the farm, but you'd be looking at how the produce is transported, how it's handled by the consumer at the point of distribution, all those sorts of things combined. And they don't necessarily represent specific criteria. They represent a specific outcome. Additionally, we looked at the EPA recreational water quality criteria and ambient water quality criteria from both 1986 and 2012. The 1986 requirements identified, as you can see, numerical requirements, a GM of 126 and a single sample maximum of 235. And then that was updated in 2012 for, again, a GM of 126, and this time a statistical threshold value of 410, which approximates the 90th percentile. These requirements are based on the concept that fecal indicator organisms can potentially predict the presence of pathogens that will cause gastrointestinal illness. So in summary, we identified water that is covered by that was evaluated by the EPA in their epidemiological studies, and identified that water can be reasonably associated with surface waters that are used to produce fresh produce. There are differences. There are differences in exposure rates. There are differences in how that water is used, but as a source water, we can generally approximate that water can be also used for the agricultural use production. We also identified that 2 anchor points exist in frameworks that are already existing by the WHO and EPA. So EPA identified an exposure limit of 36 primary recreators per 1,000 as a threshold for an increase in illness. And the WHO program identifies the tolerable health burden as 1 in 10 to the 6 per produce consumer per year. So those are our 2 anchor ends of conservative and liberal for what we believe the produce production or produce consumption risk exists in the United States. And so it's a pretty wide range, but I think that those provide our anchor ends.
I don't know what that means.
Are we taking questions in the middle, or?
Do you want to take a question or you want to put it off till the end?
I'd like to put it off till the end, yeah. And then I'm just going to quickly go through the evolution of the rule requirements. So with the original proposal, we proposed specific criteria for the quality of agricultural water. And that was a geometric mean of 126 and a single sample maximum of 235. And that was for water that directly contacts covered produce. Within that original proposal, we identified a framework for alternatives that could also provide a similar level of public health protection. And we then received a whole bunch of the testing frequency was once every 3 months during the growing season. And then it was also, we had a different testing frequency based on water that's impacted by runoff and water that's not impacted by runoff. We had some follow-up actions when water did not meet those numerical requirements. So there was a requirement to discontinue use if the water did not meet, and then growers could then treat and then re-inspect and then potentially use that water again based on corrective measures. We received a whole bunch of public comments on this framework, identifying that these requirements were too restrictive, they weren't appropriate for all commodities, and many of those sources weren't going to meet the standard. We then took that information and decided to repropose in a supplement to the original proposal. We changed the numerical requirements from a single sample maximum to a statistical threshold value while also maintaining that geometric mean of 126 samples. 126 CFU per 100 mil. We added in additional provisions around corrective measures, so it wasn't simply if you are exceeding the numerical requirements, you have to treat and re-inspect. We allowed for some flexibility in allowing for die-off. We have a provision that identifies a time interval that you could apply between last irrigation and harvest and the end of storage and, in between harvest and end of storage. We identified a specific number that you could apply, which was half a log per day for the last irrigation and harvest, and then for the time interval between end of harvest and storage, you would have to identify a number that would be most relevant to your operation. We had a tiered approach to the testing frequency, so growers would collect samples over 2 years to quantify that. Growers would have to collect samples over a period of 2 years to quantify what that water looks like, to take a sort of a snapshot of what the water quality is, and then annually re-verify that water quality. The that baseline characterization that you had would have to be updated once every 10 years, or sooner if it was necessary. For untreated groundwater, growers would have to collect 4 samples in 1 year and then update once annually afterwards. For the final requirements, we then updated the testing frequency to be once for untreated groundwater. Growers would be then testing once every year after the initial 4 samples. And then for untreated surface water, growers would be testing an initial profile from over 2 to 4 years, and then annually verifying 5 samples thereafter. Growers would then have to recharacterize that microbial water quality profile if there was some reason to reasonably, I'm sorry, everybody. Growers would then recharacterize that microbial water quality profile if there was some reason to believe that water quality profile had changed. This long-term snapshot enables growers to understand what their water looks like over a long period of time. We maintained those numerical requirements for agricultural water that directly contacts covered produce, not sprouts. We also maintained the corrective measure for allowing die-off in between last irrigation and harvest and end of harvest and storage. A lot of the questions that we've received around how growers can comply and then potentially also identify alternatives to these numerical requirements can be addressed through how we evaluate same level of public health protection. We recently issued guidance around how growers can potentially calculate same level of public health protection, and we posed 4 questions. And those 4 questions are whether or not the relevant data is sufficient to make a determination whether you have an appropriate level of public health protection, whether there are any unique considerations that could be provided by that measure, whether there was an evaluation of scientific and technical evidence that was conducted by competent individuals in an appropriate process, and whether or not the same level of public health protection has been properly documented.
All right, I promise I'm the last FDA speaker for now, and I'm not going to take that long because we wanted to save some time for questions since it sounds like there are some burning items that we want addressed. So we wanted to give a quick overview of just the reassessment, where we're at now, some of the steps moving forward, as well as touch a little bit on compliance states. I know Dr. Ossoff had mentioned them, but just talk a little bit more in detail about them. So the reassessment, that's why we're all here. We're looking at ways to simplify the ag water standards, and this was based on a lot of the feedback that we've been hearing over the last couple years, concerns and challenges with compliance. And so part of this process is not only figuring out which specific aspects of the rule we'll be looking at simplifying, but also the process for simplifying that. So whether that would be through guidance, rulemaking, combination of the two. We've received a lot of questions over the last couple months about what type of input we'll be considering, because I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we've received a lot of information over the last couple years on this. And so all of the comments that we received throughout rulemaking, I forget who it was who mentioned it, but we received an unprecedented number of them. So all of that is still on the table. Many of them were specific to water. We're also taking into account the information that we received through the Technical Assistance Network. So there are a lot of questions sent in through there, concerns, areas where clarification could be helpful, as well as describing scenarios that don't necessarily align with the current requirements. And so that's all been really helpful to us to inform our thinking. We're also taking into account the information that we are learning through attending different conferences, meetings, summits like this, where we're working in groups, discussing things with, growers and researchers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next couple slides because we're really looking at stakeholder engagement as being a really integral part of this process. So after we announced that we would be looking at ways to simplify the requirements in March of 2017, kind of the next major milestone for us was our proposal to extend the compliance dates for ag water. And so this is for covered produce other than sprouts. So again, nothing changes for sprouts. They have the same dates that are in the final rule. And so under the final rule requirements, the largest farms would be required to begin sampling for their profile in 2018. And if finalized, this proposed extension would mean that they would have an additional 4 years to start their sampling. So growers would have to start sampling for the largest farms in 2022, from which point they would have 2 to 4 years to finish their profile. So that would be a completed profile between 2024 and 2026 or so. So this first came out in September, and it was open for comment, and that comment period closed in November. If anyone's interested in seeing those comments, I believe they're all publicly available in the docket. And in that proposed rule, which Dr. Ossoff had touched on, we said that we won't be taking enforcement action against the ag water for produce other than sprouts. Again, nothing changes for sprouts. And so what this means is that farms who are currently testing can continue with their current testing programs. There's no need to make any costly major changes to align with final rule requirements. For farms that are not currently testing, it might be a good idea to start just to kind of get an idea of what type of water quality you're working with and start establishing some of that baseline data. But again, no need to start establishing like a long-term profile or anything. And in the meantime, we would also look for farms to continue using those good agricultural practices to help ensure the safe use of our water. So we wanted to go over some of our outreach activities. I've said that we're looking at this as being a really integral part of this process. So we're kind of looking at this from a three-pronged approach. So the first is different conferences, meetings, and summits like this one, where we're getting information from different presentations, breakout sessions here, things like that. We are also working with a group of technical experts, and these are situated throughout the country, and they cover a variety of expertises, if that's a word. So we have, produce people on there. We have water system specialists, water microbiologists, and they represent a couple different groups. So we have some other federal agencies on there, academia, extension, researchers. So the goal of this is really just to listen to their expertise and see if there's any way to make some of these requirements a bit more workable for growers while still protecting public health. We've also been going on farm visits. And these have all been arranged by the Produce Safety Network, or the PSN. So as Dr. Ossoff had mentioned, these are all our regional specialists, and so they're situated throughout the country. And they do a lot of work with stakeholders and outreach, and there are actually quite a few of them at the remote sites now. So if you're at a site with any of them, say hi. They're all really, really nice. But anyways, a big part of what they do is they set up these farm visits so that we can see farms in person, learn more about what actually goes on a farm. And so over the last couple of months, they've actually been able to set up quite a few water-specific ones, which Kruti and I have been able to go on. And that's been really helpful for us to see not only the different water application methods, but also get a better understanding of, different water sources, how water is conveyed to and on a farm, and how all of those factors kind of like come into complying with the rule requirements. And so I said that we had gone on a couple last year, and now we're in the middle of planning more for this coming year so that we can kind of get a good representation of all the different regions and different water use practices. Just wanted to highlight a couple of the meetings that we've been attending. So I think the first heavy hitter that we were at was the Center for Produce Safety Test Methods Colloquium. And this was held last April. And I really wanted to talk about this because I think it's a good example of the types of things that we can accomplish when we're given the chance to interact in situations like this. So the focus of this was going through some of the methods, some of the main concerns and challenges with those requirements, and identifying different approaches that FDA could consider adopting to make the requirements a bit more workable for growers. And so one outcome of this was that the group pulled together a summary report, outlined a few recommendations for FDA. And so when we received these recommendations, we sat down, looked at them, and saw that, yeah, a lot of them made sense, and they were both workable and protected public health. So in response to this, we posted a list of methods on our website, and there are currently 9 methods on there that we have determined are equivalent to method 1603, and a lot of these are more widely available. And this list includes methods that report results in both CFU and MPN, which is a major concern that we had been hearing over the last couple years. And as we find out more about these methods, we'll be considering adding more to this list in the future. And again, I think this is just a really cool example of what we can accomplish, together. We really do take your feedback into consideration. I just wanted to highlight one other conference or meeting, I guess, that we went to, and this is, again, just a short list of everything that we've been at. We've also been at different research symposiums, IFP, irrigation and drainage conferences, so really trying to get a broad swath of information from them. So this past October, we attended the Collaborative Food Safety Forum, and this was hosted by Pew Charitable Trusts in Washington, D.C. And the focus of this meeting was really to discuss the pre-harvest criteria and sampling requirements, some of the major concerns with them, and again, different approaches that we can consider moving forward. And similar to the CPS colloquium, one outcome of this was that a summary report was generated that outlined a few options for FDA to consider moving forward. And this included both short and long-term approaches. And they kind of all differed in how the actual issues were addressed, whether that be through guidance, rulemaking, research, or any combination of those factors. At this meeting, we also discussed some of the topics that would be good to bring up here. And so a lot of that information was used to inform the breakout sessions and kind of the main questions that we want to address here, which leads us here. And again, I'll just reiterate what all of us have been saying, that we're really glad to be here. Looking forward to listening in on these discussions and hearing from you. And I think we're all really looking forward to learning some new information about water. So that's all I have for now. Kruti and my contact information is up here, and I'm not sure if we have time for questions. We do.
Yes.
Perfect.
Awesome. So Kruti's going to come up. We'll leave Chelsea and Kruti both up here to ask questions. We've got people with microphones. Thank you. So we will start with Andre in the back. And then you guys can answer the questions. Okay. Make sure you use that. Okay.
Remind people to use the microphone. Yes, my question pertains to the threshold requirements. There were some numbers up there. I understand when you're giving levels of E. coli, but I didn't understand 36 per thousand incident. Could you explain how those numbers, what those numbers mean, and how those numbers are relevant?
Sure, yeah. So the 36 NGI per 1,000 primary recreators, that's the EPA number, that was the threshold at which that study identified an increase in illness. And so the way that they had characterized that was there was a specific definition of what illness meant. And so I would encourage you to go and look back at that because I don't have that definition off the top of my head. But it referred to gastrointestinal illness. And so when primary recreators got in that water, they were submerged in the water, and then they came out, they realized that there was that threshold of 36 The increase in illness occurred at 126 CFU per 100 mils. That under that threshold was under 36 people getting sick per 1,000. So does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, and then the daily number, the WHO number, that's 1 in 10 to the 6 people is the tolerable limit for people getting sick eating fresh produce that's been grown with reclaimed or reused water that's been treated. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, so those are our 2 anchor points. And that's kind of what I was trying to get at, although it was definitely not clear as I think back on it now. But those are our 2 anchor points where we say the burden of health limit falls in between those 2 numbers for the produce safety rule because our exposure rates are different. We don't have the same types of exposure as you would if you're going to get into a surface water lake and go swimming, and it's not going to be the same as you would expect from consuming fresh produce that has been grown with treated reused water or reclaimed water. So that range is really wide, and I just wanted to illustrate that we have I guess we have a lot to work with as far as where we fall with our public health burden, because operations vary as far as the commodity type, the geographic region, what happens up and downstream from water uses, how produce is transported, and then how it's also handled after harvest. So there's a variety of factors that go into it, and I just wanted to identify that it's harder for us to pinpoint one single public health burden. Did you want to add anything to that?
Nope, that was good.
So I have 2 texted in questions from the South.
Oh, okay.
The first one I think is for Chelsea and the addition of the methods. There was a question of, do those additional 8 methods also have in them the 16-hour hold time between sampling and sample processing?
Yeah, so I think some of them do specify the hold time, but I know that there are a few that do not. For right now, I would say try your best to meet what's outlined in the method. If there isn't anything in the method about hold time, you can contact your local extension agents for, I guess, advice, or just use general best practices. We really don't want anyone stressing that much right now about meeting hold time requirements in the methods themselves. So just do the best you can.
All right. These are the extension agents asking the question.
I know.
So just want to throw that out there.
So talk to her.
The next question, and I think Kruti might have touched on it already, has to do with the documentation supporting the level of public health protection for the 126 and 410. So if you're trying to show something meets that public health burden, I think the request is that you give examples of how to show that documentation. I think that's the question.
Okay.
It lacked some context.
I may refer to Samir on this as well. Yeah. So I think as far as your question goes to documentation of that public health protection, the guidance for same level of public health protection was just issued about a month ago, month or 5 weeks ago. And so in that, we provide a lot of discussion around what that might look like. There's nothing that's hard and fast at the moment about what that documentation would look like. I think if there are valid studies, if you can show the relationship, I think that all of those factors combine into, showing that there is an appropriate relationship between the public health protection provided in the requirements for the rule and then an alternate to that level of public health protection. Does that kind of answer the question, do you think, or?
Unless I hear otherwise, I'm going to go with yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I also have a question from a remote site. How does this apply to different methods of irrigation? So, for example, drip irrigation versus overhead. Can you speak to that?
As far as alternatives, or I guess I'm not sure what we're.
How does it apply equally to drip irrigation as it does to overhead? Is it all the same?
As long as the water that's being used directly contacts the covered crop. If it directly contacts, then the requirements apply.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Oh, sorry, it's also the definition of ag water. So, okay.
Yeah, you say that the growers can continue to use their testing methods. What exactly does that mean? That mean when the compliance and enforcement dates begin, you will accept those previous testing methods, or will they have to change their testing methods? In 2022 and so forth.
So do you mean like the actual test methods themselves, or just sampling in general?
Yeah, you said that they will accept. What did you say? No. Growers may continue with their current water testing programs.
Okay.
Currently, I mean, will their current programs be accepted on the compliance dates, or will they have to change when the new compliance dates are enforced?
Not necessarily. We're really just saying, in the meantime, we won't be taking enforcement action against the ag water requirements. That proposed extension is still proposed, so it's not yet final. And we know that because there are a lot of concerns, we don't want people making any costly changes. So we're just saying, for now, don't worry about making any major changes. If you're testing for other reasons, then you can continue doing that. That's fine. While we kind of, I guess, figure out better what our thinking is on this and how we're going to simplify things. We're just saying, don't worry about making major changes.
So another remote site question from the south around sampling methods and representative sampling of a water body, and what what a representative sample is and what defines a source. When do you anticipate to have more answers around that?
Well, I mean, I don't think we have a set timeline in mind, and it looks like Samir has something he wants to say. But I will say that that's part of this process, is that we're looking to hear from you guys about what might make sense, what would be workable, and so we're taking all that into consideration rather than kind of rushing to make a set decision, just focusing on, working with you guys for now. Anything else? Okay.
Okay, I have a question from a remote site, and that question is, when will you address the sampling methods and representative sampling of a water body?
We just answered that. That made it easy on us.
Apparently, I get all the texting questions. This one specifically asks, so if a grower asks us, I haven't started my water sampling, should I start or should I wait until 2022? What should our answer be?
Well, I would say, again, that extension is still proposed. There's no need for them to, make any major testing decisions based on the final rule requirements. So right now, I would really just say, do what works for you. If there's a different approach that seems to make sense, then just stick with that for now. Kind of get that base understanding of the water quality that you're working with.
So your recommendation then would be to start testing in some sort at this point, but wait to try to test to meet whatever rule requirements end up?
Yep.
Thanks.
Yep. Wait, microphone.
So on one of the slides, it said that you'd be exempt from having to test the water if it was either treated or was treated with some type of chemicals that would eliminate the microbial risk. Does the FDA have a list of all those proposed or all those approved methods and chemicals to treat the water?
No, we wouldn't necessarily have a list of approved chemicals to treat the water. So there can be a variety of ways in which you can treat your water. And so as long as the water meets the numerical requirements outlined within the rule for the definition of agricultural water, that water could then be used. And if the water is treated by a public water system or a municipal system, as long as you have the certificate of compliance that water has been treated to a certain level that meets the requirements, then that water does not have to be tested either.
Okay, I was thinking more along the lines of we treat our water more for algae protection, and I was wondering if that it does have some microbial kill as well.
So you want to go first?
Sure.
Go ahead.
So I guess who regulates the chemical antimicrobial treatment is, I mean, honestly, it kind of confuses me. But depending on the use of the water, it's either at EPA or FDA. And in this case, any of those chemical treatments would be regulated by EPA. So yeah, I guess that's the best we can answer right now.
And the label, the indication for the treatment would have to be for an E. coli. It wouldn't. You couldn't have an off-label use that would then meet those requirements. Yeah.
Question over here.
I'm a little.
In looking at the post-harvest use, the requirement is just an absence. All the testing methodologies result in a quantified result. An absence test should be cheaper and more readily available. Is there an effort to list some of those methods on the accepted testing strategies?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we've heard feedback on, and it's an item that we could consider. Probably not right now for the pre-harvest water because we need those quantifiable measures, but at least as far as guidance for the post-harvest testing, then that is something that we could consider doing.
I'm a little confused. The 2-year extension for water testing, is that done or is that still proposed?
It's still proposed. Yeah.
Sorry, this one is going back. I've lost it. This one I think is going back to the treatment and the label of different treatment for chemicals. And there is just a suggestion that since EPA is in the room, perhaps they could be asked to provide a list of appropriately labeled water antimicrobial
I'm not touching that
pesticides.
one.
I think that might be asking a little much of our EPA collaborators that are in the room to have that list off the top of their head. But Kevin is bravely going to take the question.
Since EPA was
You're on.
Since EPA was listed, we're the Office of Research and Development, so that's a policy. It's a policy side, and we're not in the treatment side of the shop either. So, sorry.
Thank you at least for addressing the question.
Okay, so another question I've got is, will any of the regulations address endocrine disruptors, chemicals such as atrazine?
Not this regulation.
Yeah, no, the scope of this regulation is limited to microbial hazards associated with fresh produce production.
Okay, and then I have another question about surface water. Untreated surface water not permitted for post-harvest water use. What if the surface water is treated and tested and shown to meet standards?
If it's treated and tested and shown to meet standards, then it can be used. The prohibition is around untreated surface water, and you cannot use untreated surface water. So even if that surface water somehow had no detectable generic E. coli, we still wouldn't be able to use it because it's untreated.
There was. Oh, you get one more. That's it. Go ahead. Last question.
There was just a remote question asking if you have a suggestion on when the proposed 2-year extension might be solidified or finished.
I mean, we're still, the comment period closed, so we're still kind of going through those comments. Samir, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add on that.
Just no specific.
Can't see.
I know. All right. Yeah, there's no specific time frame for it. I mean, obviously, we would like to get it resolved as soon as possible. But no specific time frame.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. With that, we have reached 11:15. We have our speaker gift bags.